Hi, this is Epimetheus, and I'm thrilled to bring to you today another fantastic collaboration with Flashpoint History, where I got to do some drawing of Romans, Carthaginians, silhouettes, and got to see them in some fantastic animations. He has a passion for history, and if you haven't done so already, go head over to his channel and subscribe to see much more amazing content like this. And the best part is, want to know more about the Punic Wars after seeing this amazing episode? He has 10 more videos on it. I have watched them all and can guarantee you'll love them if you have an interest in this time period. And now, Zama.
The war at this point had been going on for a very long time. Hundreds of thousands of men had been lost on both sides. Yet Rome and Carthage continued the fight. Carthage, however, was on the decisively losing end of the conflict. The armies of the Republic had pushed Carthaginian forces back on every front. Now Roman forces were at her very doorstep and were led by the general Publius Cornelius Scipio, who proved he was up for any challenge. But not all was lost. Hannibal Barca, the greatest military mind that Carthage had produced, and arguably one of the best military minds in history, had assumed command of the army. Their armies met on a dry, dusty plain in North Africa, in what would one day be the country of Tunisia. These men were veteran generals who had never before been defeated in battle. Both had cunning minds that put them into a league of their own, and perhaps this is part of the reason they decided to meet. A few days before the battle, Scipio had managed to capture some of Hannibal's spies in his camp, but instead of executing them, he gave these men a grand tour of his forces. He knew that they'd report back exactly what they saw. But Scipio's cavalry had not yet arrived, and he specifically wanted the spies to report that as well. However, Hannibal already knew about the missing cavalry, and he was intrigued by his opponent's use of deception. He wanted to meet this man who he had heard so much about, a man that seemed to use the same tactics that he himself would have used. Scipio, too, was captivated. He was, after all, at the Battle of Cannae, and he saw firsthand what Hannibal was capable of. They met face to face the day before their armies were to fight. Scipio needed the time to bring in his horsemen, and Hannibal wanted to arrange his new conscripts. But it was more than just tactical maneuvering. They wanted to size each other up, and perhaps they were just curious about what their opponent was really like. They quickly discovered that they had a lot in common. Hannibal was born into the upper class and was a consummate warrior. He was trained by his father, Hamilcar Barca, who was also a military genius, a general that defeated Roman armies in Sicily during the First Punic War. When it was Hannibal's turn, he decided to invade Italy in 218 and won impressive confrontations at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, which is still regarded as one of the most impressive triumphs in all of history. His dagger thrust into the heart of Roman Italia brought the Republic nearly to her knees. But Rome decided to fight on. They adopted a policy of non-engagement to avoid a direct fight, and instead played a battle of attrition that lasted for over a decade. The Carthaginian government was unable to provide timely reinforcements, and so his dutiful brothers Hasdrubal and Mago tried valiantly to come to his aid. Both men died in their attempt to help out their sibling. There were simply more casualties in this massive conflict, but Hannibal was not the only one to lose his family members. Scipio was also born into aristocracy. He was the son of a Roman consul by the same name. His father and uncle were lost in the war. Both were killed in Spain to Carthaginian forces. But the young Scipio, barely escaping death himself at the Battle of Cannae, would go on to command a Roman army. He took this force to Spain in the year 210, and then using military brilliance won decisively at New Carthage, Baecula, and Alyppa. This was his masterpiece victory, and it was in this baptism by fire that Scipio honed his abilities in tactical audacity. Now, it was also in Spain that he encountered the superb Numidian cavalry commander Masinissa, who at the time was working for the Carthaginians. Scipio ironically knew he needed Masinissa's expertise, and despite the fact that this Numidian was partially responsible for the deaths of Scipio's family, the Roman commander went to work bringing Masinissa to the Roman side. In 205, Scipio returned to Rome and became one of the youngest consuls in Roman history, and by unanimous vote. But when he proposed a direct invasion of Carthage, he was immediately rejected. After considerable effort, he was able to finally get approval, yet his political opponents denied him the ability to levy new forces in Rome. Scipio did manage to gain some volunteers in the capital, but he knew a place where he could find more men for the army. On the island of Sicily, the 5th and 6th legions had been placed in exile. These were the remnants of the men who had been defeated at Cannae. They had been left, as a result, in a state of living limbo as punishment for their failure. Scipio was going to give them a shot at redemption, and so he incorporated these men into his army and then trained all of his men to peak efficiency. With his men well prepared, the Roman general then invaded North Africa and brushed aside a Carthaginian force at the Battle of the Great Plains in 203. This victory prompted the Carthaginian government to sue for peace, but in reality they used the time to recall Hannibal from Italy. They were going to need him for a last-ditch defense of the homeland. Hannibal answered the call and brought the remains of his army with him, but these men were his veterans. They were also at the Battle of Cannae, but now they were fighting for the very continued existence of Carthage. The Battle of Zama, as it would be called, was thus a rematch between men who were fighting on one end for their redemption and on the other for their very survival. Hannibal was the first to arrive on the battlefield. He had 36,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 80 elephants. He deployed his infantry into 3 lines. The first line consisted of his weakest mercenary troops, men who he had very little time to train. His second line was his citizen soldiers, people who were levied from Carthage and Libya. And in his third and last line, he placed his veteran soldiers, men who had served him well for more than 15 years. Going into the battle, Hannibal knew that Scipio was famous for his enveloping double pincer attack as he had done at the Battle of Alyppa, and so he intentionally held back his third line to dissuade the Romans from doing this tactic. On both flanks, he placed his cavalry, and with the intent of sending in an opening charging attack, he placed his elephants right in the front. On the other end of the battlefield, Scipio also had his forces in 3 lines, but he only had 29,000 infantry. In typical Roman formation from front to back were the hastati, which were his youngest and least experienced, followed by the principes, who were men in the prime of their lives, usually also rich enough to afford better equipment, and finally the triarii, the older but most experienced and thus best equipped of his forces. But unlike typical Roman formation, Scipio didn't place his base units, known as maniples, in the standard checkerboard pattern, but rather in single file to create alleys between his men. This was done because he correctly guessed that Hannibal would bring his elephants to the field, and thus prepared his men for the attack. On the flanks, he placed his numerically and militarily superior 6,000 cavalry, which included on the right flank the Numidian prince and commander Masinissa, who felt it was now the Romans who gave him the best chance to claim his Numidian throne, which was kinda his goal all along. In the front of his line, Scipio placed his velites. These were skirmishers who masked his true formation from Hannibal's view. The battle began as Scipio predicted. Hannibal charged out his elephants in a direct attack on the Roman center. As the elephants approached, Scipio ordered his cavalry to sound their horns, which frightened some of the animals, causing some of them to run back into their own lines, trampling those in the way, especially on the Carthaginian left wing. As the rest of the elephants neared the Roman formation, the Velites blended back into the line, revealing the alleys between the soldiers. The elephants chose the path of least resistance, running down the lanes, which made them easy targets to be brought down by spearmen on either side. Masinissa watched as the Carthaginian elephants were dealt with, and then launched his cavalry into the Carthaginian left wing. The Roman cavalry on the other side, under the command of Laelius, did likewise. Unlike other battles where Hannibal had the superiority in cavalry, and thus had the potential to unleash drastic and very mobile attacks, at Zama his horsemen were outnumbered and soon began to fall back. With no alternative, Hannibal ordered his cavalry commanders to withdraw and lure their Roman and Numidian counterparts from the field, which worked. For all their tactical brilliance, the fight now between Hannibal and Scipio became an infantry brawl. Scipio sent in all three of his lines. Hannibal did the same, but he kept his veteran third line back in reserve, just in case Scipio tried anything unusual. The Hastati smashed into Hannibal's mercenary troops, pushing them back. But Hannibal's second line, seeing a rout in the making, began to lower their spears and pointed them at their own comrades, and thus got them back into the fight. The Carthaginian counterattack drove into the Hastati and destroyed their line. It was now the Romans' turn to reinforce a crumbling front, which was done by the Princepes. This counterattack stopped both of Hannibal's lines in their tracks. The fighting started to intensify, and soon the Carthaginian line began to falter and break down. Seeing his enemy's confusion, Scipio now gave the order to change the entire configuration of his army and extend his front line. His Hastati soldiers regrouped and formed the center. His Princepes assembled on their flanks, and the veteran Triare rallied on the extreme wings. Perceiving the potential for an envelopment, Hannibal mirrored Scipio's move. He brought up his veteran soldiers to create a new center, and then he assembled his mercenary and conscript Carthaginian and Libyan forces on the wings. The Battle of Zama now came down to a single Roman line taking on a single Carthaginian one. This was a gruesome confrontation, and at one point, Hannibal began to gain the upper hand. Holes began to form in Scipio's forces. The Roman formation, exhausted by fighting, it was said began to lose ground. But just as this was about to be a Punic victory, the Roman and Numidian cavalry under Masinissa appeared again on the field. The horsemen drove directly into the rear of Hannibal's army, and the results were inevitable. It was no longer a battle, but a massacre. The Carthaginians suffered 20,000 dead, with another 20,000 captured. The Romans sustained only a fraction of that, but they had won the fight. The Second Punic War was now over. Carthage had to sue for peace and was strapped with a punishing treaty and massive indemnities. Scipio recognized Hannibal as being a worthy adversary and an honorable man. Their meeting before the battle only reinforced in the Roman commander that there was something redeeming in his opponent. So instead of being dragged back in chains to a Roman triumph, Hannibal was allowed to live and would serve Carthage now in an administrational role. Eventually, he would come to lead the establishment. But as the war came to a close, both men returned to governments that were hostile towards them. Hannibal did too good of a job in government, bringing wealth to the rank-and-file people instead of just the aristocracy. This incurred the wrath of other politicians who ironically reported him to the Romans and forced him to run for his own life. He escaped as a fugitive to the east, but eventually was cornered and decided to drink poison rather than ever becoming a prisoner. Scipio had also come too far too fast. Many of his colleagues in the Roman Senate hated him, and while they couldn't take down a war hero of his magnitude, they instead accused his brother of misdeeds. Eventually, a disillusioned and frustrated Scipio would go into a voluntary exile. Strangely enough, both men died in the year 183. Hannibal died as he lived, on his own terms. As he drank the poison, he was remembered as saying, Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety that they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. Scipio made it a point to be buried away from the city of Rome. The inscription on his tombstone read, Ingrata patria ne osa quadeam mea habeas. Ungrateful country, you shall not even possess my bones. Carthage recuperated from the war a little too well. She paid off her debts in no time and grew once again to be an economic powerhouse. This frightened the Romans, who wanted her to be submissive at best. The Roman senator, Cato the Elder, became the biggest proponent for the annihilation of Carthage, and he would end all of his speeches with Delenda Carthago est, that is, Carthage must be destroyed. Eventually he got his wish, and 50 years after the Second Punic War ended, the Third Punic War began. A Roman army under the command of Scipio's adopted grandson, a man named Scipio Aemilianus, managed to take the city in 146. It was now that the pent-up hatred that the Romans had was finally unleashed. Temples were torn down, the city walls destroyed, the foundations uprooted, and her people dispersed and sold into slavery. Scipio Aemilianus then gave the final command to set whatever was left to the torch, and a firestorm of unprecedented magnitude consumed and gutted what was once the proud capital of an empire. But as he watched the flames, he began to weep and became pale at the sight. He was approached by his mentor, Publius, who recorded that when he had given the order for the firing of the town, he immediately turned around and grabbed me by the hand and said, "Publius, it is a grand thing, but I know not how. I feel a terror and dread, lest someone should one day give the same order about my own native city." And so it came to pass that 550 years later, Rome would also face the carnage of her own firestorm. Flashpoint History is dedicated to making history accessible to everyone. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe. Please also share on social media. It's the only way a video podcast like this can continue to grow. I'd like to take this time to thank my Patreon subscribers. It's lovely people like you who allow for videos like this to be made. Now, for those of you who want to help with the process, consider contributing on Patreon. The link will be in the description. You can also follow along with Flashpoint History on Facebook and Twitter. Also, a big thanks to Epimetheus, who helped me with the artwork. He's got a great YouTube channel as well. You should definitely check it out.
Epimetheus here again. Don't forget to head over to Flashpoint History's channel, sub, leave him a bunch of likes. He put a lot of work into this fantastic series, and it is always rewarding to receive feedback. So let him know what you think.